Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Boudreau. I'm Manomet's Donor Relations Manager. I want to thank you so much for joining us for tonight's presentation, all about the International Shorebird Survey. We've got a really great panel lined up for you tonight. If you're new to Manomet, we are a science-driven sustainability nonprofit organization. Since Manomet's beginnings in 1969, our programs have branched out far beyond our Plymouth, Massachusetts-based banding operation, with shorebird recovery and habitat management, forestry and climate science, fisheries, and more. Manomet has its foundation in science and works with many global partners to create a thriving future for us and the birds. Just a couple of quick things before we begin tonight. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a box marked Q&A. If you don't see it, just use your mouse pointer to hover over the bottom and it should appear. If at any point during tonight's presentation you have a question, just feel free to click on that Q&A box and enter it. Monica Iglesias will be collecting your questions so that we can answer them at the end. And if you're unable to stay for the entirety of tonight's presentation, it is being recorded, and we'll share the link with you in a follow-up email, and you can watch it on demand or share it with others. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lisa Schibley, the North American coordinator for the International Shorebird Survey.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Schibley, and I work in Manomet's Shorebird Recovery Program. We are very excited that you all are here with us today. We're going to be talking about the International Shorebird Survey, which is a project started at Manomet in 1974 by Brian Harrington. Here with us to talk about the different aspects of ISS are some of my favorite shorebird experts. We have Brad Winn, who is the Director of Shorebird Habitat Management for Manomet, and also the Director of ISS. Brian Harrington, founder of ISS, and Manomet scientist Emeritus will be talking about the origins of ISS. Arne Lesterhuis coordinates ISS in South America. I'll be talking about ISS in North America. And Paul Smith is a scientist with the Wildlife Research Division of Environment and Climate Change Canada and has worked with ISS data for about 10 years now. He is also the co-author of a paper which last year brought attention to the loss of 3 billion birds across North America. He'll be talking to us about the work he does with ISS data and what it all means. So hopefully by the end of our presentation, you will know the answer to all these very important questions, and more significantly, you'll know how to become an ISS contributor. Because as you can see, shorebirds are declining, and to know where conservation is needed, shorebird scientists need citizen scientists collecting this data. By the way, there's a good chance that you've seen this graphic before. It was created by Cornell for the 3 Billion Birds Project, which Paul Smith is going to talk to us about later. So first up is Brad Winn with an overall look at shorebirds and ISS.
Hey all, thanks for joining us tonight. Quick shout out to Juliana Almeida in Brazil, who's our lead down there for ISS, and we'll be coming to you soon, Juliana, and look forward to that. A little brief overview of what shorebirds are. There are lots of birds that like the shore, like the coast, and are collectively called water birds. We have seabirds, you'll see in the upper left, and that's gulls, skimmers, terns, pelicans, and such, mostly fish-eating birds. Waterfowl, represented by this nice common merganser female in the upper right. Lower right, wading birds, so all the egrets and herons and storks and ibis are all classified as wading birds. So tonight, and the focus of about 17 people at Manomet full-time is the conservation of shorebirds. And the little guys in the lower left are semi-palmated sandpipers. And you'll see them standing in water, and that's really classic shorebird habitat. And knee deep to a shorebird is really important stuff because they use those bills, as you'll see in just a minute, to go down and probe and get the foods they need, usually under the surface of this wet sand. Okay, Lisa, next slide. So why shorebirds? What is the deal? Why are so many people, very focused group of people at Manomet and other other organizations and other agencies dedicating themselves to the conservation of this unique group of birds? They're closely tied into very specific habitats. And some of those habitats are coastal for sure. And that really magic intertidal zone between the high tide and the low tide is an overlooked resource and very special biome in the world. Those authorities, federal agencies, state agencies that oversee various wildlife groups usually miss out or don't have anybody focused on studying these intertidal areas. Those areas are very specific and very valuable to shorebirds and other wildlife. And so we are using them as indicators for that. Also, they're very important. Another important habitat for them is freshwater margins, lakes, streams, rivers, and also some are grassland specialists. So this is a unique group of birds that have some great conservation challenges that we're taking on that have very unique habitats and unique needs as far as the habitat they depend upon. Okay, Lisa, next slide. So as Lisa mentioned, there have been great declines in about the last 30 years for some species. Some species are doing okay, and there are a few that are actually increasing numbers, and Paul Smith will go into that a little bit later in our talk tonight. But in general, we're really interested in the conservation of the populations of these birds, trying to maintain the health of the populations of the species in the Western Hemisphere, and that's what our focus is. ISS is a Western Hemisphere project that Brian will go into a little bit later as far as its origins. Based on the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative priorities for threats, we understand that some of the key threats to shorebirds right now, hunting, kind of surprisingly, but hunting in some regions of the hemisphere, Caribbean and across the north coast of South America, there's some hunting pressure. Predators, predation that has been enhanced by human presence. So around humans, some predators take advantage of garbage and access to more food resources, and the populations tend to come up. And as a response to those populations of predators coming up, there is a negative response on pressures from beach nesting birds and other birds that are influenced by those predators. Disturbance is a big issue and one that we're studying right now quite thoroughly. Virginia Tech is a partner with us studying that, and National Audubon also. We're really interested in the impacts of disturbance from people, from dogs, from vehicles on beaches particularly. And then habitat loss and change is a huge one, of course, and it ties right into the changes from our changing climate. Climate change impacts such as sea level rise are things that we're quite concerned about and definitely impacting shorebirds throughout their ranges. Okay, Lisa, thanks. Next one. So underlying our efforts are inherent challenges to how we approach conservation of these birds. There's some of the most migratory animals on the planet. And so if you think about a species or even an individual bird that has a range from Alaska or Arctic, Eastern Canada, where Paul spends a lot of his time, all the way down through all the Americas, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and some of these birds go all the way down into the coast of South America. So huge geographies of these birds that are traveling long distances. They aggregate in large numbers frequently in very high densities in areas where there are good food resources. So that both that creates vulnerability to them and also gives us an advantage in understanding population change. And so we're focusing a lot of our attention and time on very specific locations. And you'll hear that theme coming up during the talk tonight. Many populations have very low numbers of individuals. So some of our most well-known birds, American oyster catchers, for instance, have somewhere around 12,000 to 13,000 individuals on the east coast of the U.S., which for any population of wildlife is quite small. And a large percentage of shorebirds have numbers under 25,000. So we're starting out with very vulnerable numbers that don't have a lot of buffer for changes or threats to the populations. The habitats that I mentioned earlier are some that have been the most abused by us over time, over the last couple of centuries. They are the wetlands that these birds depend upon, the grassland that birds depend upon, the prairies that some depend upon for breeding or for migration have been really hit hard by our presence and our development. And then another one is that these birds are very hard to see a lot of the time. The public is not fully engaged with shorebirds because they're usually, lots of them are coming through in very short periods of time. They prefer remote areas where there's less disturbance from people. And the habitats they adhere to usually are in areas where people are in low numbers and really don't get a chance to see them. So to talk to the public about conservation and trying to get initiatives underway can be a difficult task. Thank you, Lisa. Next slide. So just a little bit of an overview of ISS, International Shorebird Survey. It's volunteer-based and it is designed to collect population-level data for these birds. We are restricting ISS to the Western Hemisphere throughout the Americas, as I mentioned earlier. And Paul might mention the two Canadian sister programs that were initiated about the same time in the 70s and early 80s. And collectively, the data are used together to give us some answers on trends and such. Go ahead, Lisa. We've got a series here of, you can just scroll down all of them. I'll go one at a time. So we're trying to enhance our knowledge of roots for all species, and that's something that Brian really started out with back in the early 70s, and we're continuing to do that. We're trying to continue to learn about the specifics of how these birds fly, where they go, and ISS helps us understand that. We're definitely trying to continue to understand where the hot spots are, where the birds are in need of conservation action, conservation effort. And we have a mechanism or strategy that also came from the early 80s to the mid 80s with the US and Canada working closely together. And that's the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. It's continuing and it's growing in strength and numbers of identified sites, and the International Shorebird Survey plays a role in that, in the establishment and the discovery of new sites that are important. We also have Habitats for Shorebirds, which is our applied management tool, which is we get to the ground and work with the individuals who oversee or have authority over the habitat and the landscapes of the WHISRN or Western Hemisphere Shorebird Network. So that's another mechanism that we developed over the last 5 or 6 years. We also play a role in contributing to research and certainly guide project implementation with our partners that reach out and need help in helping establish or launch conservation actions. ISS plays a role in that. We use the data to help guide those projects. We're very interested in one of the more effective things that it's kind of an unsung hero of the ISS network is that we've built a steadily growing constituency of people who are engaged with shorebirds and build a support group, let's say, for shorebirds throughout the U.S. and South America and the Caribbean now too. And so that's one of the great benefits, is to have a growing group of people that are really engaged. And some of you on this call, on this webinar now, who do not know much about shorebirds or are not hooked yet, go out and spend some time with them and contribute to ISS, and you'll be a shorebird fan as well before you know it. And then again, we're gonna get into estimating population sizes a little bit later and show you some of the trends. Okay, Lisa, thank you. Next one. So a little bit of the applied management of how we use the numbers. And that is, again, I mentioned the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Definitely, we're active with that group. And we use ISS to prioritize applied conservation activity, both locally, say in a wildlife refuge or a wildlife management area, and then looking at applied activities hemispherically too. So broad and short local activities. We definitely measure the response to management actions. One of the goals of our Habitats for Shorebirds project is to apply activities such as what you see on the screen. This is actually a beneficial use of dredge material on the North Carolina coast. And this is creating habitat specifically to enhance and increase the feeding area for shorebirds along that coast. So we have the opportunity to look at over time the response of the birds to management actions like this one that we've helped steer. And this is actually, this is a picture by Walker Golder of Audubon for work that he mostly was promoting down there. Long-term and short-term trends, both with populations and with habitat, based on erosional activities. We're really interested in where those key sites are being lost. And there's quite a bit of that going on the Atlantic coast with very key shorebird areas that are being eroded by increased storm surge and with sea level rise. And ISS plays a role in helping us understand what's going on the coast because of the volunteers and the professional biologists that work with us will let us know what's going on in their areas. And then, of course, we're working with very specific research projects, and we feed ISS into academic institutions for a variety of different purposes and studies that they're interested in. And it goes from beginning students all the way up to professional biology. I'm going to turn it over to Brian Harrington now, and go for it, Brian. And thank you, Lisa and Chris, for making this happen.
Thank you, Brad. So I want to talk about why we started the ISS in the first place. And that story starts with the career I had before I came to Manomet, which was working with seabirds on ocean islands in the Pacific. And this is a picture of a sooty tern colony. And it is in here to highlight the fact that in some parts of the world and in some situations, birds concentrate at single locations to a very high degree. This bird colony at Johnston Atoll in the Pacific serves the entire seabird population for roughly 500,000 square miles of our Earth's surface, our sea surface. And so I'm starting about shorebirds with seabirds. Next slide, Lisa. Thank you. So the concept here is that, and that we set out to try and collect data to show with the ISS is that some birds, like shorebirds, migrate in a fashion where they tend to concentrate at particular spots shown in the lower part of this chart as dots. They concentrate at particular spots, and then they'll get up and they'll fly a long distance, sometimes 1,000 or more miles, 2,000 or more miles, without stopping, to their next stop or maybe on to the wintering ground. And so this long hop migration strategy puts a huge importance on the stopover areas that they're using. This contrasts with things maybe like robins or swallows, which I love, but which fly short distances, stop, maybe spend the night, maybe feed for a day or two, and then move a couple 100 miles or 50 miles more, and then so on until they get to their wintering area. So shorebirds, for the most part, are long hop migrants, very dependent on their stopover areas. So next slide. So as a kid, I grew up on the coast of Rhode Island, and I would walk miles along the shorelines, and I might see 1 or 2 shorebirds or maybe a dozen or something. But whenever I could, I would try and persuade one of my older friends who had a driver's license to take me to some spot like Newburyport or Monomoy on Cape Cod or in Westerly, Rhode Island, where there would be huge numbers of shorebirds. And so when I came to Manomet, I began thinking, maybe shorebirds are like the seabirds in depending upon a very small number of locations as their migrations stop over places. So next slide, Lisa, thank you. So that was basically the reason that we started the International Shorebird Survey, to try and figure out where shorebirds are occurring across a whole continent requires a lot of people and coverage of a lot of places. And when I started at Manomet, we basically had no money to do anything like that. And so we decided to start the International Shorebird Surveys and enlist volunteers to please go and do all that work for us and send us the information. So we started in 1974, and this is before internet, actually even before computers, home computers. We started contacting people through bird tour companies, through bird clubs and Audubon societies, and writing hundreds of letters and basically trying to enlist people to adopt one location that they would then go to every 10 days during key migration periods and count the shorebirds. And so that was the beginning of the International Shorebird Surveys. And as it happens, quite coincidentally, a similar survey was starting in Eastern Canada in the Canadian Maritimes, called the Maritime Shorebird Surveys, set up by Guy Morrison of the Canadian Wildlife Service. Neither of us knew the other was doing, what the other was doing, but we quickly learned about each other and coordinated our efforts pretty carefully in the following years. So we asked people in South America also, as well as in North America. Part of our goal was to show the key stopover areas, but we also wanted to know how each species might move across the landscape in their migration. So did a white-rumped sandpiper and a bared sandpiper migrate in the same fashion between their Arctic wintering grounds and their southern Arctic breeding grounds and their southern South American wintering grounds? So we wanted to find out how the different species moved across the landscape. So that was another reason for starting the shorebird surveys. So with the help of hundreds of people, by 1980, we had a very clear picture that yes, indeed, shorebirds were concentrating to a very high degree at key stopover areas, most kinds anyway were, and that these areas were pretty strategic in the annual cycle of these birds as they move around our hemisphere in their migrations. So that was a clear outcome. And one might ask, well, why did we continue doing the survey after that? Well, we hadn't covered the whole hemisphere yet. And ideally, we would try and get a much bigger sample to refine the picture that we had started to develop. And so, Lisa, with the next slide, please. By year 5, we basically had accomplished the primary goal, but we had a lot more, we felt we had a lot more to do, and we began working on those, on increasing the coverage and refining the sort of screen of information that we were accumulating. So next slide, please, Lisa. So I just want to close with a picture of red knots on Delaware Bay. And as time went on, we began to realize that in order to take one species and really show the whole concept we were trying to get at with the ISS, that the red knot would be particularly suitable for doing that. And so as time went on, we also began to work pretty carefully on red knots, pretty intensely on red knots. So next slide. So it's very clear from the survey information that the nature of shorebird migrations make them particularly vulnerable to loss of their staging areas. We documented also that a huge and dedicated network of volunteers can collect information that is key to making good conservation planning for wildlife that is moving on a global scale. And then also, I think our effort showed well that a good database, a good accumulation of factual and scientific information can lead to the birth and growth of an international conservation initiative such as the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which took on a life of its own and grew very rapidly with help of various countries and loads of people throughout the hemisphere. So it's a wonderful testimony to what can be done with a very dedicated volunteer network. Lisa, next slide. And I just want to close by acknowledging that this has involved hundreds of people and in fact, probably thousands now of people who have made this project a success and who have been together able to create a picture of shorebird migration on a hemispheric scale that we had to have in order to move forward with conservation planning. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so I'm the coordinator of ISS for North America. And I'm one of the folks that have to make sure that the amazing system that Brian created 46 years ago continues to supply data to the scientists. So I've created this little movie that shows the ebb and flow of ISS sites over the years. Each pink dot is an ISS site. And it's amazing to me to see how much data has come in from areas all across this part of the globe. And I did make one for South America too. Arne doesn't have it yet, but we'll make it part of our presentation soon. It's also interesting to see how some regions fill in while others thin out, and then the trend can reverse. Overall, however, you can see that while we've had quite a number of very dedicated contributors from the Central and Pacific flyways, the consistency of coverage is strongest along the eastern seaboard, which is where Manomet headquarters is. So my goal for ISS is to increase coverage everywhere, but it is especially important to target recruitment in the area with the fewer dots. So these are the sites that have been covered by ISS in the last 3 years. If you're currently contributing data to ISS, your site is on this map. So I want to thank you sincerely for your efforts and dedication. None of what ISS does would be possible without you. And again, with this map, you can get a feel where we have gaps in coverage. And by the way, I know that there are some great shorebird spots in Idaho. So if you're from Idaho, give me a call because there's nothing right now in Idaho. So one more way of looking at the ISS data across time. These are numbers of surveys submitted by ISS contributors. And yes, there are thousands from 1974 to 2019. And the biggest takeaway that I get from this chart, and you can see both North America and South America. The biggest takeaway I get from this chart is how much room there is for growth. So how are we recruiting? Our habitat management and WISRM teams conduct workshops at important shorebird sites across the Americas, and recruiting for ISS is an important part of that. We also reach out to bird clubs and social media groups like on Facebook. And we hope to visit birding and shorebird festivals and Audubon meetings, similar ways that Brian mentioned that he found volunteers originally. Really, if we can think of a place where shorebird enthusiasts gather, we want to find them. So if you think that your club or your group would like to hear from us, let us know. And next up is Arne, and he's going to tell you more about the work that he does for ISS in South America.
Okay, hello. Thank you, Lisa. I'm looking forward to that video then of South America that you prepared. Hi, everybody. I'm Arne. I'm Dutch from origin, but living and working in Paraguay for the nearly 20 years. I think I became part of the ISS team in 2016. And yes, my main task was to try and increase coverage again in Latin America and the Caribbean. I cover most of this region, but as Brett mentioned in the beginning, in Brazil, ISS is coordinated by Juliana of the NGO SABE Brazil. And so the part of growth of ISS in Latin America in recent years is thanks to the work of Juliana in Brazil. So the majority of the Nearctic shorebirds spend their time away from the breeding grounds and can be found in Latin America and the Caribbean. They depend here on numerous sites that are of key importance to their survival during their non-breeding season. And much of these sites were unknown when Brian started ISS, as we just heard, and well, better said, we know now that it was one of the main reasons that he started ISS, to understand more. And today, thanks to ISS, we gather data that is necessary to understand the status of shorebirds and their sites that they depend on during their annual life cycle. And also to understand how the threats that were listed by Brad early on in this presentation, how they affect shorebird populations. So that is why the hemispheric scope of ISS is so important. Only counting in North America does not really give us the full picture. So any changes to a key stopover site or a winter site along the flyway can have a negative effect on the species. So I just want to briefly illustrate this and show you an example from a shorebird stopover site close to my home here in Paraguay. Next slide, please. So this is the Asunción Bay. It's one of the few known stopover sites for the buff-breasted sandpiper during southbound migration. And since 2000, the bay has been monitored for ISS frequently, in the beginning weekly, then later on a little bit less. and it provided the knowledge regarding its importance for shorebirds. And in 2006, it was declared a WISN site of regional importance, which means that at least 1% of the global population of the species uses this site. So unfortunately, in 2010, the construction of a bayside road destroyed about 70% of the shorebird habitat due to dredging. Well, you can see that here on the photo, a before and an after photo, and it clearly shows the impact to the site. But maybe more interesting or more important is to look at the graph with ISS data, which only shows data for the buff-breasted sandpiper, but it shows how this impact changed the population that visits the bay. So without the monitoring data, it would have been quite difficult to detect the impacts. And currently we are working on restoring the site. And also for that, we will need the monitoring data to understand whether what we do is actually successful. Next slide, please. So ISS is important for conservation of Nearctic migratory shorebirds and their habitats, but ISS does not only focus on the Nearctic shorebird, but also shorebirds that are resident in Latin America and the Caribbean, and even migrate within the region, which we call Austral migrants. So here you can see a least snipe, which is a species of shorebird that looks a little bit like a mix between a dove and a quail maybe, but they belong really to the shorebird family, and it migrates. As you can see on the map, they breed in southern Patagonia during the Austral summer, which is the boreal winter, and then they move northward to escape the Patagonian winter. So unfortunately, they do not get as far north as Paraguay. You can see the red dot on the map, that's where I am, and it doesn't get there, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So a couple of other species that show similar migrations are, for example, the two-banded plover, the rufous-chested dotterel, and the tawny-throated dotterel, which are all here on the slide. They all have breeding populations in Patagonia and move northward during the Austral winter. And the two-banded plover, which is the top right, is the most numerous one of these and can gather in flocks of up to 4,000 individuals. So these South American species share habitat with the Nearctic migrants, and in many cases they depend on the same sites when they migrate. Next, please. So ISS is important in Latin America and the Caribbean for both Nearctic and resident species. So my task was, like a couple of years ago, to try and increase participation in order to get more data from this region. But it should be recognized that in the past, Brian's enthusiasm with ISS was quite effective down here, especially in the early years. The graph here on the slide is, well, shows the participation in Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of number of countries and number of sites. And it represents the first 20 years of data from Latin America, running from 1974 till about 1994. And during that time, about 18 countries participated in the survey, covering about 164 sites, and they were surveyed by about 77 volunteers. So he did reach quite a lot of people. And the database held about 11,000 records of shorebirds and covering about 4 million counted individuals of 51 species. This included 36 Nearctic shorebirds, but also 10 resident species and a couple of species that are shared, which are, for example, American oystercatcher or killdeer, which have breeding populations in both continents. So based on the gathered data during these first 20 years, several sites became WISN sites, as we heard earlier in the presentation, but there also still are a couple of potential WISN sites in this historic database that maybe at some point will join the network. Okay, next slide, please. So here a little bit on the current situation. Well, you can see that since 2016, we can definitely see a grow again of participation thanks to new volunteers signing up. These new volunteers are either known shorebird biologists that we meet at conferences, for example, but also we identify them through eBird, for example. So we have been sending mails out to people that upload shorebird data to eBird, and then invite them to share that data with the ISS protocol on eBird. And well, this has been pretty successful. It helped increase ISS in South America quite a lot. So in 2016, we had 5 countries participating, and now we're last year it was up to 16 countries already. So that's a nice increase. And now we have about, well, close to 150 volunteers here in whole South America, or Latin America and the Caribbean. And that includes Brazil as well. And over the past 3 years, more than 100,000 birds have been counted, including quite some resident species as well. Next slide, please. So, and regarding the most abundant species, oh, sorry, I see that there is one slide missing. So there should be a slide that's showing the 5 most common species recorded during the last 4 years. And I just wanted to highlight that among these 5, on the 3rd place is a Austral migrant, which is the 2-banded plover, which is quite a common one in ISS in the past 4 years, which is interesting to see. So to finalize, I wanted to comment on some past and current limitations and opportunities of ISS here in this region. Starting with coverage, well, we heard a little bit about this from Brian as well. I mean, it was one of the limitations was that there were like not too many bird watchers in the 70s, 80s, and specifically not here in South America or in Latin America in general. So you can imagine that even less people will be looking at shorebirds because they're not the easiest birds to watch, of course. Nowadays, that's quite different. That number of bird watchers have grown a lot. And throughout the region, you can find bird observation clubs and other networks of people interested in observing and counting birds. And such groups have helped a lot to increase participation in the region over the past years. A lack of regional coordination was probably a bit of limitation as well back in the days. Specifically, if you think about the limited internet, which wasn't even there. So that was really until maybe the 90s that came up. And so before that, as Brian mentioned as well, it was quite hard to reach people. That changed, of course, when internet became more widely available. However, not as quickly down here. So in Latin America, it was always behind North America. So coordinating and recruiting was still quite a complex task, even in the beginning of 2000. So today, reaching out and recruiting is much easier, and there are a lot of opportunities to expand the network. We are now looking into national coordination and see if that's a way to help increase participation, because that's a way to help recruiting and provide more guidance to new people. Equipment and resources, well, ISS without good optics is difficult. You will need good equipment, preferable a good pair of binoculars and a scope. However, also that might be not as easy here to get as in North America. And maybe the same can be said about available resources to identify shorebirds. Access is often limited to general field guides, which are not always the best materials for shorebird identification. Sometimes more specific guides can actually help you better and make you feel more confident about what you see. So investing in this in the future can be an opportunity for ISS to expand further. And then finally, through training and more outreach, like promotion materials, there are a lot of opportunities to further grow as well. The training workshops, for example, that Habitats for Shorebirds division of Manomet has been organizing in several countries in South America, have helped recruiting volunteers, but also the newsletter that we are now presenting twice a year helps showing people the difference they make by being a volunteer and how the data is used, etc. And of course, webinars like this will also help to spread the word. And finally, last but not least, volunteers are what ISS makes successful and has made it successful all these years. And well, they've done it now for over 40 years. So they helped identify key sites, migration routes, migration timing, and status of species and sites. So yeah, the volunteers really are the backbone of ISS, but I would like to say that they are also the backbone of monitoring programs in general. So thanks for this time.
Great, thanks Arne. My name's Paul Smith and I'm going to follow up where Arne left off and speak to you a little bit about how these data are used. So, as Arne mentioned, volunteers are the backbone of this program. And as a volunteer who heads out to their favorite coastal site every couple of weeks, I mean, this is a significant undertaking. And so I want to give you a flavor of how these data are used and how valuable they are, just so that you can understand in your mind, how important a contribution you're making. Next slide. But before I begin, I just want to explain why it is that a Canadian scientist is here speaking to Americans and South Americans about the value of ISS. So Brad at the outset tried to convince you that shorebirds were coastal temperate birds that used water. And Brian was talking about migration sites, and Arne even tried to convince you that these were Latin American species. But from my perspective, these birds, many of the shorebirds are Arctic birds. If you were to land in a tundra wetland in Arctic Canada, you'd find that the most abundant and diverse group of birds is the shorebirds. And I'm an Arctic biologist. My job is to study the trends of populations of Arctic birds and try to understand the problems and correct them. And as Brian mentioned, these Arctic shorebirds concentrate during migration. So in some ways, the best way to understand their populations is to go outside the Arctic and study them there. And that's exactly what I've done. And this work to understand the trends in the shorebird abundances is done in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Adam Smith, who's also with Environment and Climate Change Canada, pictured in the top of your screen there. And so Adam and I, over a number of years, have analyzed these ISS data to try to understand the trends in shorebirds. Next slide, please. And so if I could see the folks that were out there, I would ask for a show of hands, but I won't because I can't see you. But if I were to ask you to raise your hand, if you've heard this statement that shorebirds are declining, I'm confident that nearly everyone would raise their hand. This is commonly said. But I would ask, says who? Who has said that shorebirds are declining, and on the basis of what information? Well, if you're one of the many people who participate in the ISS, it says you. It's the ISS that has allowed us to reach this conclusion that shorebird populations in general are declining. Next slide. For most species of shorebirds in North America, the International Shorebird Survey and the companion programs in Canada, the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey and the Ontario Shorebird Survey, for most species, these are the most important sources of monitoring information to evaluate trends in abundance for shorebird populations all across North America. And for many species, the Arctic breeders in particular, this is the only source of information with which to evaluate trends. Some species have coverage from the Breeding Bird Survey, but for Arctic breeding species, the International Shorebird Survey is really it. And we've used it for many applications, as I'll show you in the coming slides. Next slide. One of the most impactful ways we've summarized these data is in various reports that have the name State of the Birds, so State of Canada's birds, State of America's birds, North America's birds. These summaries bring together information across species and present them in really digestible formats. And if you're not familiar with these reports, I would encourage you to go online and look them up. In 2016, there was a summary of the North America's birds, and that's pictured on the left. And you can see that overall, on average, species had declined by 70% since the 1970s. And then more recently in the America's State of the Birds, 2019, we used a different format where we looked at the total abundance of shorebirds across all species and concluded that nearly 40% fewer shorebirds of any species are around now than they were in the 1970s. Next slide, please. And a similar report from Canada, I think, summarizes this situation quite nicely. So this is from the State of Canada's Birds, which was also released in 2019. And you can see from this figure how shorebirds fare in comparison to other groups of birds. So shorebirds, with this 40% overall decline in terms of total abundance, are alongside grassland birds and aerial insectivores as the most threatened group of species in all of North America. And contrast that with waterfowl or birds of prey that have recovered since the banning of DDT. And you can see just how dire this trajectory is for many species. Next slide. So these overall trends are very impactful from the perspective of understanding broad patterns, but it's also interesting from a research perspective to look at how we can parse out species and understand if they tell us anything ecological. if we look at migration distance for the shorebirds, we see that the trend for the long distance migrants is much more dire than that for the short or medium distance migrants. So for example, American oystercatcher is doing quite well in comparison to the red knot, say, which is among the longest distance migrants traveling from the mid or high Arctic all the way down to southern South America in some cases, and amazingly doubling and then halving its body mass in order to sustain those ultra long flights. Next slide. There are other ways that we can slice and dice these data as well. So this figure shows different colors for the magnitude of the trend and different sizes for the precision of the trend, which really equates to the amount of data. And so if you look at the colors, you can see that there are more red colors in maritime Canada, suggesting more negative trends, and more blue colors in the northeast US coast, suggesting less negative trends. So this suggests here that this white-rump sandpiper is doing more poorly in Atlantic Canada than it is in the United States to the south, suggesting possibly that these more northerly stopovers are somehow changing more than the more southerly stopovers. And so these kind of clues can give us information to direct our conservation and management efforts. Next slide. But perhaps one of the most impactful ways that we've summarized these data is a more recent effort. Last fall, we were converting these trends into actual abundances of birds by taking our knowledge of the population size and our knowledge of trends and combining the two. And we did this for shorebirds and other species of birds. And this is how we arrived at this compelling figure of nearly 3 billion birds lost from North America. And I thought I would share just a little bit of a historical perspective on the importance of this result. Next slide. So if we zoom back in time to the early 1900s, in 1914, the last passenger pigeon died in captivity. So imagine prior to that, in the 1800s, this was the most abundant bird in North America, estimated to number somewhere between 3 and 5 billion individuals. And then the species was hunted to extinction by the early 1900s. Even at that time, which is not a time when conservation was top of mind, even at that time, this caught the public's attention. And shortly thereafter, the Migratory Birds Treaty was enacted in 1918. Next slide. If we fast forward to the early 1960s, again, we see birds playing an important role in environmental consciousness. This is in 1962, Silent Spring was published by Rachel Carson, which was a look at the importance and the impacts of pesticide use on biodiversity, and using birds as an example. And this book and this work is considered to be an important pivotal moment in the birth of the modern environmental movement. So birds here spawned environmental consciousness and concern for biodiversity in general, beyond birds. Next slide. If we fast forward another 50 years to the present day, this result about the loss of 3 billion birds captured the public's attention more than we even would have imagined. So as I mentioned, the ISS played a pivotal role in this result. The International Shorebird Survey data is the basis of this finding for declines in shorebird abundance. And these results were packaged up by Cornell and other collaborators into a wide variety of really compelling videos and graphics and infographics. If you haven't seen them, I encourage you to check out the website. And these compelling pieces of information were taken up by the media to an absolutely astonishing extent. Next slide. So this is not even up to date. I mean, as of several months ago, there was something on the order of 1,800 print media articles and numerous television pieces reaching perhaps 4 billion people, describing the impacts of this loss of birds on ecosystem services, talking about how humans are altering the environment, and extending this message beyond birds to biodiversity in general. So this reach is something that we couldn't have imagined. I mean, certainly we're pleased by it, but it without a doubt is the most impactful result that I've ever been involved with. And I think it's a compelling example of how these citizen science programs can capture public attention. Next slide. But more specifically, I think it's also helpful to look at some actual conservation impacts. You know, beyond public consciousness, there are some demonstrated examples of how these ISS and other results are being used. So, for example, here is an image of a Republican Congressman, Morgan Griffith, holding up the press release about the loss of shorebirds and other species, while advocating for a bill to make buildings more energy efficient and the glass safer for birds. So this is a practical direct impact of these results. Another practical impact, the ISS, being the most important source of trend information for shorebirds, is frequently used in assessments of species for candidate listing under, in the United States, the Endangered Species Act, or in Canada, the Species at Risk Act. In Canada, for example, we're currently assessing the trends in 14 species of Arctic breeding shorebirds to consider them as potentials for listing. And then another example that might come to pass in the near future, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is an important piece of legislation that's being considered that could bring $1.4 billion in new funding for conservation programs. And this loss of 3 billion birds has played an important role in political support for this act. Next slide. So since 1918, we've made a lot of progress in bird conservation. But you know, if we take the contrast of this example of 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons being hunted to extinction and 3 billion birds being lost from our backyards in the last 40 years, I would argue that perhaps we have a long way yet to go. However, the work that you folks who are involved in the ISS are doing is truly having meaningful impacts to save birds and biodiversity. And I think it's important to take a minute just to thank you all for that dedication and that hard work. And also, I should mention, just because they won't likely thank themselves, Manomet has played a really crucial role over the last 40 years in delivering this program with limited government financial support. So I think Manomet also deserves an important high five for excellent work at monitoring these birds over the last decades. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks for that high five. We appreciate it. So now that we have inspired you to count some shorebirds for ISS, how do you do it? The first thing I'm going to talk about is how to choose a site. We don't assign sites to our volunteers. You guys know your patches. You know where the shorebirds hang out. The only thing that we ask is to check, is a site already covered? And you can do that on a new tool that we are developing called the International Shorebird Survey mapping tool. Right here, we're looking at a section of Massachusetts that's a little bit north of where I live. So if I were interested in conducting ISS on the Third Cliff Beach, I would look at this map and I would say, oh no, someone's already doing it. But if you click on it, you will see more details about every site. So this site has only been covered, was covered from 1974 to 2002. And in fact, it was covered by a gentleman named Winn Peterson. Some of y'all might know who that was. But it has not been covered recently. So this tool lets you find what good sites in your area. And if you find a site that's been covered historically, but not covered now, that gives your data even extra value. So once you choose your site, how do you cover it? The ISS protocol is very simple. Please visit at least 3 times each spring and each fall. More data is always better, so we would love every 10 days. But we do ask at least 3 times each season. Visit the site in the same way, cover the same area in about the same amount of time at about the same tide if it's a tidal site. The consistency is very important, a very important part of ISS data. So we emphasize that. Please be consistent in how you cover your site. Count all the shorebirds at your site using your best estimation skills for flocks. Monica created an awesome webinar recently about flock estimation, and you can find that on Manomet's YouTube page. And be careful and conservative with identification. So shorebirds can be tricky. We know, I still have trouble with the dowitchers. So when in doubt, just use a SPA. So a peep SPA or a dowitcher SPA works just fine. And lastly, submitting your data to ISS is as easy as submitting your data to eBird. Start your checklist at your ISS site using the eBird app. Count your shorebirds and other birds too. And after stopping the checklist, under the drop-down menu for survey type, choose International Shorebird Survey. That's it. That's all you need to do. So you can indicate tide and other important conditions in the checklist comments. And if you forget to tag your ISS list in the field, it's easy to do on the eBird website. So submitting data to be used by the shorebird scientists that you've heard on the webinar today is as easy as that. Thank you again for joining us and for your interest in the International Shorebird Survey. Participating in ISS is one of the many ways that you can make a difference for the shorebirds that we all love. And remember, if you're looking for more information about the mapping tool, about protocols, look for the ISS newsletters and more eBird instructions. They're all on the ISS webpage on manomet.org. And if you have any questions, we'd always love to hear from you. Our emails are up on the screen. So please email us or reach out on the ISS Facebook page. And with that, I'd love to hear about any questions folks have during our presentation from Monica.
Hey, Lisa. Yeah, we had some questions coming in. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. One of the questions was, what are the limits of volunteer data?
That's an interesting one. That might be one for Paul or Brad.
I'd be happy to comment on the kinds of data that we can use. So one of the most important things for us is that the counts are repeated at a fixed site. So it's important to know that you're counting the same site over time. You know, if the boundaries change, that's problematic. And also, as Lisa mentioned, we need repeated counts within a season. There's no strong protocol limitations as long as the count that we're getting is as similar as possible over time. For the most part, we can use it. Another important thing is because of the models we use, it's not imperative that, it's ideal of course, but it's not imperative that a site be visited every year. So if a site has been defunct for a few years and somebody wants to take it over again, we would still be able to use that full time series of data because our models can fill in the blanks for the missing years. So I would encourage folks to consider picking up sites that have been orphaned.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
All I would add to that is that we will help you too with your identification skills. So there are some limits to volunteers that are jumping into shorebird identification right away or early on, and we will help you come up to speed with the birds you're looking at. We can help you do that. So thank you for the question.
There's also there have been a couple questions about the connection between ISS data and eBird. And so one was, is there a connection to eBird with ISS? And are the data that are entered into eBird under ISS incorporated into the eBird database?
The answer to the second question is absolutely. eBird is an amazing database that we love encouraging folks not just counting shorebirds, but to count all of the birds, any birds they want to. And eBird does amazing science with those numbers. For us, eBird is just a tool that we use to collect our ISS data. So eBird was, so brilliant in creating the interface for birders to collect their own data, and we can use that mechanism to pass the data from eBird to us for our uses. So the relationship between eBird and ISS is really, they're exactly the same. We just take the data from eBird into our models.
And then there have been a couple questions about how to get in touch and find a location to help out and become an ISS surveyor. So what would be the best way to jump into that?
If you know where your shorebirds are, you can absolutely start doing a survey any day. And if you need help finding where the shorebirds are near you, you absolutely can reach out to us.
Great. A lot of questions have been answered by Brad, or I have jumped in here. So if you have more questions, oh, here's some more. If we missed the spring migration for an ISS site, should they still do the fall migration season or skip the entire year?
Don't skip. More data is always better. So it's amazing, but the fall migration starts in July. Some of the earliest non-breeders are returning on from their breeding sites very quickly. So go ahead and start your site in July and send us data from July and August and September and October and all the way into November.
Okay. Here's a question. In the prairies, there's a challenge with counting at the same exact location over multiple years, because one year a place can be a good shorebird spot, but the water level or the water table can change, and a few years later that place might actually be a canola field or an agricultural field. Any thoughts on how to handle a situation like that?
Yeah, let Paul go. Go ahead, Paul.
Jump in. Certainly there's certain situations. I mean, for example, there was some surveys in Manitoba started recently that covered large areas. And so what I would suggest, and this is something we'd want to discuss before you invest too much effort into it, and by all means, Lisa can share my contact information with anyone who's interested. What I would suggest is you define a large area that encompasses habitats that might be poor in some years and good in others, so that you have a block that in any given year you can survey all the good habitats, and the location of those good habitats might shift around from year to year, but you're going to survey the good habitats in that whole block, and that block is going to remain consistent over time. And that block might be defined by concession roads or some other geographical features, but it has to be something that you could say, I have counted all the shorebirds in this block every year. They just might have moved around from time to time.
Great, thank you. I just want to check in on time. So there are more questions, but I want to check in about how many more you might want.
I think
We have time for.
I think we have time for one more. I'm not sure.
Okay. Here's a question that says, can we enter legacy data? For example, I have eBird numbers from the past 3 years for spring and fall at my patch shorebird site that I visit weekly. Can I post date and label that as ISS?
As long as they are done consistently. Like you wouldn't, if you visited, say it's a tidal site, and sometimes you visit in the high tide and sometimes you visit at low tide, and the numbers aren't necessarily consistent. If you know that you visited this site always at the same time in the same way, over the same area, then absolutely. All you need to do is go onto the eBird website, and where you select, instead of stationary or incidental, you scroll down and you'll see International Shorebird Survey is one of the choices, and you can flip it right over. Absolutely.
All right, well, Lisa, Monica, and everyone, I just want to thank our panelists so much for sharing your insight and your knowledge with us today. It was really fantastic, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this special presentation. I know many of you are longtime members and supporters of Manomet. I just want to say thank you and let you know how grateful we are for your generosity and your commitment. If you'd like to learn more about how you can support Manomet in the work that we do, I encourage you to visit our website at manomet.org, and you can also find information on upcoming webinars and other programming there. So once again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you.